Hey guys, welcome to Two Side Outdoors. So this episode is going to be a little different. What it is that I am helping out Howl For Wildlife with one of their action center review things, and it's just helping them get the word out basically. And yeah, so enjoy the episode. Thank you.
Hi, I'm John Stallone. Welcome to Howl For Wildlife's Conservation Corner. Your favorite host has stepped up to support your hunting and fishing heritage by agreeing to share our message on their platform. Each month, we will be releasing a show discussing the current issues surrounding hunting and fishing. So be sure to thank them for all they do, and thank you for tuning in. Now let's jump into this episode. Hi, welcome to Howlcast Action Center Review. We are talking about feral horses and specifically about something that's going on here in Arizona. It's going on in other states too, but I believe right now there is a push because they are destroying natural habitat and outcompeting wildlife. That there's a specific herd of feral horses that they're calling for a humane removal of. We're going to be talking with Jonathan Fasaro, and Jonathan is you're what, a wildlife biologist by trade, and you're a wild horse. I don't know what to label that, aficionado. I guess I don't know.
Yeah, yeah, I'm a wildlife biologist, and I own six Mustangs, and my wife mostly, but I help with some of the training of Mustangs and getting them to homes through the BLM TIP program. So I've gained a lot of knowledge over the years of horses and wild horses and feral horses and kind of the whole dynamic and controversy centered around them as a biologist and just a horse owner.
Awesome. So, I guess let's just dive into it. Can you kind of give us a rundown of what's going on um, with this deal in Arizona right now?
Sure. So I've been getting myself familiar with this topic for a little while, but there's a lot of information out there to digest. So what I know about the situation and that I've learned is there are a group of feral horses or a herd of feral horses that are in kind of the southeastern corner of Arizona that are reaching a level that it's become pretty clear to the Forest Service that they're deteriorating natural habitat, specifically riparian areas, pretty significantly. And we have to identify this area, or we should in this discussion, that these are considered feral horses by the Forest Service. They've done extensive amount of research and documentation, but these horses are not horses that were present prior to 1970s when they established the Wild Horse and Burro Act, and they don't have any documentation of these horses being present in this area
Mm-hmm.
at all since the 40s. In fact, they don't have any records of any horses out there since the 40s. So they use certain criteria to establish what is considered a wild herd protected under the Wild Horse and Burro Act, and these horses have been clearly identified by the Forest Service through multiple types of analyses that these are actually feral horses. And essentially what they've concluded from that research is that these horses have come in through grazing allotments that were allowed in the 90s in the area, and essentially issues with maintaining fencing. And if anybody knows about fence maintenance, when you're talking about miles of fence and trying to maintain them, especially in a forest habitat, it's really challenging to keep the fence up and keep your stock in that area.
Mm-hmm.
And they've just had years of issues with maintaining fence through funding issues and just, people helping keep it up. And horses from original allotments, grazing allotments, have kind of established themselves in this area. And then
wasn't it also a fire that rolled through there in
Yeah,
2011? Yeah,
exactly.
I think it was
Yep. So
2011 that's destroyed quite a bit of fencing that allowed these horses to migrate over.
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, you're totally right, John. Yeah.
Well,
So the Wallow fire in 2011 burned like 500,000 acres or something like that,
yeah.
and it de- destroyed a lot of fencing, which allowed for more horses to get into this country, and specifically from the neighboring White Mountain Apache tribal lands. So the Fort Apache Indian Reservation has horses in that country, and they have moved into this Apache National Forest area. And, there's, not gelded male horses in there, and, stallions essentially, and that can breed with viable females, and they've been the population's been growing. So I think their estimates right now are conservatively around 400 horses in that country. So the big issue with this is, for one, they're not a designated wild horse population, and so with the Forest Service, they have to, by law, do something about this. Now, they're not really claimed by somebody, so they're not considered to be what they would call kind of like
Livestock or
there's a specific term, but they're basically feral horses. They're not stray horses as they would consider them by law.
okay.
And so, and with that, there have been some research projects done and some looking to the species that exist in this area where these horses are, and they are showing signs that they're affecting numerous endangered species like the New Mexican jumping mouse, the Apache trout species. There's a garter snake species in the area that is potentially being affected because these horses have major impact on riparian areas. There's the leopard frog species of some sort in that area, and then indirectly they think they could be affecting Mexican spotted owl and this Three Forks spring snail as well. So there's a whole suite of species in that area that are of concern for the Forest Service, and they're under certain types of protection, and they're seeing destruction to the native habitat in that area by these horses. And if anybody who has horses knows, even domestic horses, how kind of destructive they are in what they do. I'm always fixing things that they're damaging on my property, and then if you have them in a riparian area, they cause mass amounts of deterioration around that riparian area, really focusing on the edges and the banks and beating them up as they get down to the water, and that creates erosion, and then erosion creates problems for species that aren't accustomed to that type of erosion in the water. So
I know here by me in the Phoenix area, we have a feral horse herd that's very large by the Salt River and Verde River, and they, like, in the areas that they're concentrated in, that it looks like it's right up against a river, so it should be lush and have more vegetation, more ground cover. It is literally barren, and all the trees are eaten as high as a horse can reach, basically. It's really terrible, like absolutely terrible, how much damage is being done to that ecosystem there.
Yeah, that's a really good point. The browse line, and as I'm sure is the case in that area of Arizona where they're in more forested country, there's probably a browse line that's significant, in that area, and they could identify that as well. And I'm actually located in Eastern California, so I haven't set foot in this specific area. And we also have a herd of horses that are on Forest Service land that is well known, as a feral horse population, and people drop horses off out there, which is a major issue. And, the Forest Service doesn't have a plan that I'm aware of for this. They don't do any management for these horses, so it's a kind of a similar situation. And there's actually a specific riparian area that is fenced off from the horses for wildlife use, and it's managed by this California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and they're constantly working on keeping the horses out and people from cutting the fence to let the horses in. which kind of segues this into like, if you know anything about wild horses and Mustangs and feral horse topic, this is a highly controversial
Oh yeah, it's like
subject.
wolves.
Yeah, exactly. Oh yeah, it's like wolves in some ways, even worse. I think from what I've experienced with people, and I've kind of looked at some of the websites and the Facebook pages of organizations that are interested in stopping any management of the horses in this Apache National Forest area. And, they claim that these horses are part of a designated wild horse herd called the Heber herd.
Mm-hmm.
And they're saying that these are the same animals and that these horses are self-regulating, and, they're essentially like trying to stop any management of horses in the Apache
Right.
area. And when you actually look at the analysis, because the Forest Service did a direct analysis looking at that Heber herd versus this Apache National Forest feral herd, they're over 80 something miles apart from each other with many fences, numerous, highways. Could a horse travel 80 miles through that country to eventually establish a population there? It's pretty unlikely. I mean, it's pretty clear that they're not the same herd. And, I haven't found any genetic analysis to track that for sure, but just knowing horse movement and how horses move in the landscape, it would be extremely unlikely that these horses are of the same herd. It's just not realistic to think that. And they do have evidence of grazing allotments with horses being put in there in the 90s and fence issues in that area. And then they have evidence of horses coming from the reservation onto this property. So it's really clear that this is a feral horse population and not a free roaming wild Mustang herd established. And the Heber herd has its own territory established by the Forest Service.
Mm-hmm.
I believe they set that up in, I can't remember the exact dates of when they set up, but they set that territory, I think, in the 70s. Yeah, 1974 is 74 is when it was set up. And that horse herd has been growing like by 20% a year, they said, and it's nearly doubled in the last 5 years.
Wow, so that's crazy.
It's horses are really good at reproducing, and they can outgrow their population objectives pretty quickly. And that's kind of the story across most of the Mustang populations in the West, where a lot of them are in Nevada. There's some in Wyoming and Montana, and there's other states that have free roaming wild horses, Mustangs. And, that's kind of the story in a lot of them, that they're not managed well enough, and they're overpopulated, and they're decimating a lot of their habitat and the riparian area, which is impacting like local wildlife populations really significantly.
Right.
So this is a good example, though, where it should be pretty clean cut and dry, like type of topic here or issue, where they know they're not wild Mustangs, they're feral, and they've done the analyses to determine that. And now they have a plan in place where they're actually going to start trapping, essentially like passive trapping.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw the numbers, around 20 individuals is what they have so far. And they have a whole plan to, get them adopted out to people who want them, and try to get them to homes. And will 20 horses be significant?
No.
No, not at all. It's like them just kind of throwing a bone to the people that are concerned, but not really doing much. When you have 400 something horses and you're not managing them to reduce reproduction, it's just kind of like, we're doing something, but there's not much. And, you can't necessarily blame the Forest Service for this. They're under a lot of pressure from a lot of different angles.
For sure.
It's really expensive to trap horses too. And the roundups the BLM does for Mustangs with helicopters is a big process to do that. And also, I'm not sure if that country over there is really suitable for running horses with helicopters and putting, and running them into
It's
corrals.
fairly thick.
Yeah.
It's thick old stand ponderosa.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So it's not necessarily even practical to round up that many like they do in other parts of the country.
Yeah,
So,
I know. I've spoke to another organization, and they were talking a lot about the impact on the elk herd, and in times of drought, which Arizona's seen quite a bit of in the last, decade or so, that they compete heavily for the sources and run elk off those sources. Oh my God, what the heck is wrong with my tongue? And so, like that's another major concern is, how do you, when you already talked about it with the smaller animals and the ones that are endangered and so on and so forth, is like, how do you put value on one animal's life versus another? And there's so many people, like you said earlier, that are for lack of better terminology, really invested in the well-being of horses. And
yeah.
so it's like,
It's a really good question, and it's I wish I had the answer that I could like help with all this stuff. It'd be interesting. In my field as a wildlife biologist, I've mostly focused on large mammals myself, carnivores, game species, and we manage all of those animals for the habitat and try to do our best as biologists to do so through state agencies and the federal government. And
right.
These horses are going unchecked and unmanaged at all. And the elk in that area, I think they were reintroduced in the early 1900s, like 1913, 14, 15. They're somewhere around there. They were reintroduced. Mm-hmm. And so they were established as a herd before the 1971 Wild Horse and Burro Act.
Right.
And so, if timing has anything to do with it, maybe that's something you should consider as well. But basically, the elk are managed. They're a huntable population. The deer are managed in that area. They're a huntable population. They're not managing horses at all. And, that's, you have to evaluate that. Even the livestock in that area are, all the livestock in these allotments are heavily, have heavy oversight. Mm-hmm. These people, the ranchers that are out there running stock out there are under a lot of different kind of forced requirements of them. I was looking at some of the original allotments that were established that they think that these horses came from, that were only established in the early 90s, I believe, is what I found. And interesting enough, the NEPA document, so the big document that the Forest does to evaluate the effects of the environment in the area before they do any sort of allow certain things like grazing or any other impacts to the Forest Service lands, mm-hmm. included exclusion of specific riparian areas in this allotment. And it was specifically identified in there that these ranchers that were running cattle and horses would need to keep horses and cattle out of these areas through fencing.
Right.
And the ranchers specifically decided not to graze in those allotments because of the challenge of keeping the fencing up and going and keeping their stock out of there. And now there are horses, those feral horses in that specific area, and there isn't, as far as I've seen, any real solid protection for those riparian areas. And, horses can break down fences. They can jump fences. Some individuals can, depending on the height and such. But, the elk need access to that water. The deer need access to that water. All wildlife, in that area need access to that water. And, with not allowing these horses to access all that country and all that water, is pretty significant for the local wildlife, especially in times like we have now where there's significant droughts. Mm-hmm. from what I understand, in that area, the winters, just like a lot of places in the West, the winters are not as big and severe, as they used to be with the amount of snow. And in that country, that the animals used to be pushed out of certain areas because of snow and put down to the lower elevations. But I guess now, with
they're all
lack
year.
of snow, those horses are up there all year, and they're grazing 24/7 in that country. Whereas the cattle and if there are any horses that are up there from ranchers, they're only allowed to graze somewhere around 25% of that country. And even if it's wildlife that graze 25% or help graze it, they still have to move them off of that area.
Mm-hmm.
And they move them to different pastures and they move them to different allotments. But the horses, they're grazing 24/7. Nobody's managing them. Nobody's pushing them off of these allotments. They're there all year, no matter what the condition of the range is. So that's pretty serious when you talk about the issues, of that, climate change effects on habitat, and where you're talking about the browse line and just degrading the rangeland to the point where nothing can really thrive in that country.
Yeah, it's pretty serious. I think, well, obviously that's why it's coming up. They realize that there's a problem here and something needs to be done. But of course, like everything else, we got to worry about everybody, all the stakeholders' opinions on what needs to be done and how to do it. So it's a kind of a crappy situation. But from a scientific standpoint, for me and for the greater good of everything, it's a no-brainer.
Yeah, for me too. It seems like the laws and regulations are in place to have the procedures to do what we need to do in this area to get the horses out of that country entirely.
Yeah.
Like they don't need to be, there's no laws that allow them to be in the Apache National Forest. They're not a wild population. They weren't established appropriately, and you have to draw lines somewhere. And these animals should be removed. All 400 of them, every one of them should be out of there unless they're under, an allotment, and that's exactly, they're managed through the appropriate means. But they're not. These horses are feral. Nobody claims them, and they're reproducing and they're continuing to increase. Whereas the neighboring Heber wild horse herd, they do have a management plan. The population is over objective, but they're trying to do things to manage them. But that's its own situation. This is a different herd. This is a different situation. All of these animals should be removed. So, we can have some lands without horses, where, they just don't belong. They don't belong there.
Right.
And kind of to touch a little bit on, the horse side of things, Mustang side of things. I think I mentioned, I own 6 Mustangs. My wife trains Mustangs, and I help a little bit, of course, on our property, and I do a little bit of training. I'm learning. She got me into horses, and I've come to learn, Mustangs are an interesting, breed of horses. They are different than a lot of domestic breeds you have out there, in regards to temperament and, their ability to hike and pack in the mountains with horses. It's incredible. They're extremely smart. Mustangs are, the ones that we have are really hardy. And they're good. They're a good stock, and we really enjoy having them. I pack in the mountains and with them. I hunt with them. They pack out my deer. This last year, my Mustang, my gelding, and in those animals are different than these animals in regards to their protections. They are protected, and in their different herd units throughout the West. And we obtained ours through the BLM Roundup, program, and chose them, at the holding facilities. And, we trained them from being untouched to, being pack animals. Mm-hmm. And my wife, she's a part of the BLM TIP program, which is established essentially to get Mustangs to homes. And essentially what they do is they will pay you kind of a minor incentive to be part of the program. They pay you $1,000 per horse to train them. And we usually don't come out on top. We pretty much break even for the most part with doing this, but my wife really enjoys it and I enjoy it as well. And essentially what you do through the tip program is you get these horses halterable, you get them to load in the trailer, you get them to be able to lift their feet, and you be able to lead them around, essentially just friendly them.
Mm-hmm.
So somebody can then take them and, and saddle break them and get them to be, good partners and good horses, for, whatever you want to do. And, I couldn't say exactly how many, but somewhere over 30 animals over the last few years, my wife has gotten to homes, through different training in the tip program. And it's a great program, but it really doesn't do the job of in regards to managing these herds. I mean, the tip program is cool. It gets people good horses. It's an effort to try and manage the herd, but ultimately these wild Mustangs are not managed to the degree that they need to be out on the range. Their populations most of them are far exceeding what carrying capacity is and
Mm-hmm.
what the management plans say they should be. And
Right.
I'm not, I have friends that wish, no horses existed out there on the landscape. And I get that perspective. I totally understand, that, the destruction that they do and, what is their actual role on the landscape. Some people say, oh, they've been here since prehistoric time, but the truth is they're not genetically the same animals, as far as I've found in my research, as the ones that were here prehistorically. They were basically reintroduced and then established, as wild free-ranging horses in the 70s, and saying anything prior to the 70s that's out on the landscape, they've designated as a herd. They created boundaries, and they said these animals are now wild. They've coined or defined them as wild at this point, and they're free breeding. And and a lot of these herds vary significantly. Some of them come from draft lines, some of them come from quarter horse lines, and there's differences between the herds and temperament and body size. And a lot of people see these horses and a lot of them are kind of small and not really great for certain horse folks that are doing certain stuff with horses, but other
working horses,
for working horses. But then there's other herds that are, I have a horse right now. He's 2 years old and he's 16 hands. He's a big horse.
Yeah.
So it varies, what sizes and what they have out there. But yeah, that perspective that none of them belong there, I get it. But the truth is they're here and the law protects them. And so without removing the Wild Horse and Burro Act, they're going to be here and management needs to happen. So you can hate them and you can dislike them, but they're here to stay as long as the law is in place to protect them. And, they can be really good stock to have and really good companions and really good animals, for sure. So do they need to be managed? Absolutely.
Yes.
And there's a lot that needs to be done. There are changes that need to be made to manage them. Some people are like, well, can we basically put them into the food industry and, make them dog food or, feed them to people? Other cultures eat horses, can we ship them out? And unfortunately, I think it was around 2007, all domestic slaughter of horses in the U.S. was stopped by law. So we used to have slaughterhouses, and from what I've learned and what's been kind of reported is horse abandonment and horse neglect has increased significantly since that law was passed in the U.S. It used to be a way that people could, get rid of their horses that were, basically that they didn't want anymore, couldn't sell, or, were past their prime, and, they didn't have a way to take care of them for whatever reason, financially, whatever. They get them to these markets and they would, send them to whatever slaughterhouse that was set up FDA approved, and they would, be used for whatever market wanted them. And now that doesn't exist. And some horses do get shipped out of the country. They'll go to Mexico or they'll go to Canada, but there's a lot of organizations trying to stop that as well. And, some people have told me it's like, well, we can just get the slaughterhouses back up and going, and we can get horses back into the market, and that could be really helpful. And I think that would be a great step in the right direction. But, convincing some people to accept that is really hard.
Yeah, for sure. We alluded to that earlier about it, comparing them to the wolf. I see it all the time. So my dad is a wildlife photographer, and he photographs the horses a lot. Actually, a lot of his friends kind of call him the horse whisperer because the horses let him get very, very, very close.
Oh, okay.
And he's got some amazing shots.
Yeah.
And I've been there with him, and man, even just him photographing them, there's, 10 different Karens like, don't pressure them. You're going to disrupt their breeding and blah, 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 blah. Like, please do me a favor.
Yeah.
But anyway, so yeah, I can just see the pushback on this. I'm from the, and I'm basically what you've said thus far. I'm from the same philosophy that everything needs to be managed. Like, we are the intellectual beings of the planet, and we affect everything. And it's kind of like our jobs, because we have our hands in everything, to manage everything holistically. Everything has a place. I don't think that horses necessarily need to be eradicated from the landscape, but I think that there needs to be a solid management plan all the way around. In the case of this particular horse population, yeah, I think they need to be removed, and I'm not sure what to do with them. Relocate them if there's a place to relocate them. I don't know, or part of a program like you were talking about. Actually, before I get too far along, I had a question for you, and I didn't want to interrupt you. Do you know where the funding comes from? Where's that $1,000 come from that pays you for that program to, kind of make them friendlier?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the BLM manages horses on their land specifically. And so they receive, essentially, we receive federal money, and I'm not certain exactly how, that pool of money ends up in there, whether it's just through taxes, or it's through grants, or it's through the donations. It might be a combination of all the above, and
Okay.
it might be.
It's not connected to DJ or PR, is it?
No, I do not believe so.
Okay.
I'm not,
because that would be another interesting layer.
Oh yeah, for sure. And yeah, you got my interest going. Now I really want to know specifically, and I'm not sure why. I've never really looked that up, exactly where that money comes from. But tracing the money would be really interesting, especially if it's linked to coming in from PR money. But generally, PR money isn't really used in that way at all. PR money is, and it probably isn't PR money at all, because PR money is specifically allocated to the state wildlife agency.
Right.
So
I didn't think it was a federal. Yeah.
It's more than likely not from PR. But yeah, it would be interesting to figure out where that funding comes from. Now, when you talk about Forest Service, different agency, even though you think that they should be collaborating and all shouldn't matter, but it's very different. The Forest Service, the way that they manage horses, is somewhat similar in certain areas or certain forests as the BLM, but the Forest Service horses, as far as I know, are not rounded up and sent through this adoption type program. Now, the TIP program is not the only way you can get Mustangs. You can get Mustangs just straight up at auctions that the BLM does. You can go to the facilities, literally, oh, I want that horse, and pay an adoption fee, which is $25 or $125, just depending how long the animal's been there and the condition of the animal and such. It doesn't cost much to adopt a horse. It's really not that expensive, and they make it as easy pretty much possible for the most part. There's some criteria you need to have to adopt them in regards to your facility, because they are Mustangs, and the type of panels you need are different than domestic horses, but it's a pretty simple process, really. But yeah, the Forest Service and how they fund this, I think, is quite a bit different. And the BLM has a lot more structure in place to manage Mustangs, and their management plans and the way they execute them is a lot more established than how the Forest Service does it. So what the Forest Service is doing right now, This is actually one of the first times I have looked into in depth how the Forest Service is trying to manage a population of horses on their lands. Now, this is, of course, different. They're feral horses. They're not an established population like the Heber, on the Heber
Right.
herd there. And that is on Forest Service land, but it's not the Apache. I can't remember the name of the forest in that country.
And Heber, I think Heber is still Apache. The
Yeah.
Apache Sitgraves was pretty large.
Okay, yeah.
It goes
Right.
across the whole central eastern Arizona.
It's all the same district. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
So-
it is pretty, from where these horses are at, from what I understand, they're pretty much up against New Mexico border.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, these ones are. They're the ones on the Heber are more west, like 80 miles west of there, of this feral population. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, that's a good question. The funding and how it works, it's just like most government programs, especially like in natural resources, it's underfunded and underemployed, like the amount of people
Oh yeah.
there to take care of it and manage it. There's just not as much resources as you would need to manage these populations the way you should. And in situations like this, where the Forest Service is in charge of doing it, there's even less compared to the BLM.
Right. The other thing is too about that Heber herd, not that it's like, I think the landscape that they occupy is mostly your JPs, like juniper pinyon complexes, and the actual grasslands. Because like north of Heber, pretty flat and like wide open. It's not the same. So like something that was more suitable to what horses normally occupy, like
Sure.
your prairie grassland type, where this is, like I said earlier, I believe is mostly like your old stand ponderosa.
Yeah. And from, biologists, ecology perspective, that might be a totally different situation in regards to the issues with the habitat destruction, just because, when you have a grazing animal out in more typical rangeland where they're, more designed to be in, the effects of that might be not as significant, just because,
Yeah.
that's where they're more adapted, especially if they're in a population that's really sustainable. And whereas if you're in a forest landscape and there's not as much graze and kind of the way that things are in that country, you might have even more impacts with a big, herbivore like a horse, and compared to, even compared to an elk that's more of a browser, or, elk certainly are grazers, but they browse a fair amount too. And horses will too. It's just, but I'm sure the amount of horses and, just the nature of how horses are, the destruction in the forest ecosystem is quite a bit different than would be on rangeland, open country like you're speaking of.
Yeah. I'm actually really curious now to find out this herd that's over here in the Tonto National Forest that I was talking about that my dad photographs. I'm wondering whether or not that they are a similar situation, because many people that I've spoken to have told me that's a feral horse herd. It's not a actual wild horse.
Yeah.
Designated. So, because the ecosystem that they're in is even more fragile than the one in Apache Sitgraves, because it's closer, it's more desert, and definitely more dependent on rains too.
Yeah, for sure.
So yeah, I'm really curious about it. We have other situations going on. I know it's not a little off topic here, but we got a serious burrow situation here too.
That's the burrows are pretty much the same story in a lot of ways, just not as charismatic and talked about. But they're essentially, it's a very much the same situation with burrows. It's just not the extent, as far as I know, that horses are, wild horses are as well. So, are there burrows? I'm not aware of any burrows like that are considered truly feral that aren't like part of the wild Horse and Burro Act protection areas, but there very well could be.
Oh
I
yeah.
just haven't really looked into it.
Yeah.
I mean,
I haven't either. I've wanted to kind of dip into it a little bit because it's pretty crazy. Like, not too far from where I live in Lake Pleasant area, all that whole unit's 20B is the game unit. Used to be like the best deer unit in the state for desert deer, and it
Okay.
is just, I mean, you could go days without seeing a deer now, and you would glass up 100 freaking burrows out there.
Sure. Yeah.
It's pretty
Yeah.
crazy.
Yeah. These animals, they kind of, they reproduce really well and they go unchecked. And, there is some documentation of mountain lions taking horses and burros, but I mean, not to the degree that really needs to happen in any way. They're not managing them in any way. And, and the interesting thing when, people speak about these horses, burros are a different story, but horses being, prehistoric, they should be here. They've always been here. You also have to remember that there were species of carnivores that were managing these animals at that time that we don't have at all anywhere near. Are there places where wolves maybe are taking wild horses? Maybe, are mountain lions doing it? Yeah, some, but like there's nothing managing them really. They're just being managed by the habitat. And, in our area, and you see this, there's a lot of good documentaries out there about wild horses and the current situation with them. And, there's a lot of evidence out there that these animals, they're themselves are not healthy and at all. Like you're seeing starvation, you're seeing issues with, drought and causing them to basically die of dehydration. You're seeing abandonment of foals out on the landscape. In my area near me on the Forest Service here, we have documentation of, numerous foals being abandoned just because, it's clear that the female's been bred, but she can't keep up with the milk, or she just can't keep up with maintaining a foal, and then they just leave them to die basically. Which, if you care about wildlife at all and animals at all, like you don't want to see these animals just like die of starvation and die of, just being abandoned like that, like an unhealthy animals just like on the landscape, carrying the landscape and deteriorating themselves. And the populations, as far as I've seen in research, like none of them have crashed because of this. They found ways to somewhat maintain, but still be, suffering. It's kind of a wild thing, and I'd like to know more about it, but I haven't researched, as a biologist, researched horses and the landscape intensely. But something that we haven't talked about, which I think is really interesting about this topic in this specific area, is the Center for Biological Diversity is also backing the removal of these horses.
Yeah, a very anti-hunting organization is locking arms with a bunch of hunting organizations too. Yeah, so if that doesn't tell you something, like something's wrong here, if they could recognize the need and set their agenda aside, then
when I first started learning about this, and then that was one of the first things I saw on the Howl website, was that the Center of Biological Diversity
I was floored when Charles told me about
I was too. That really got my interest. And there's a biologist that they have on staff that's been looking into this and their impacts and taking photos of the destruction out in that specific area. I mean, when you start seeing things like that, you really know it's kind of gotten overboard. Like where Center for Biological Diversity is actually getting involved, being like, okay, this is serious, And that might be, one of the things that really helps with pushing this forward, because I think we're kind of dancing around this idea, but like, I think everybody who, out in the West where you have these populations, you really should know what populations are in your area or near you, or areas that you hunt, even if you're not from the West, and know what ones are designated wild Mustang and burro populations and what their population objectives are and what the impacts are, and go out there and take a look at it when you're hunting and see, be a part of it, be understanding and be educated in it, and then learn about, like, for example, like you're getting interested in this population that you think might be a feral population, and who's looking into it. Like, nobody says anything about it or doesn't
Oh, it's a
raise
super
concerns.
touchy subject. That's why there's a lot of people that, I mean, like lots and lots of people that go there and photograph them, graph
Oh
them
yeah,
daily.
yeah.
So,
And that's the same story where I am. I mean, people love horses, and they do bring value to an area, for things like wildlife photography. And, there's high schools, I think the high school in the area where the Heber herd is called the Mustangs, like their mascot in the Heber area is called the Mustangs. So like, it's clear, like people do like the horses. They are very majestic. Seeing them out in the wild like that is pretty amazing for people to see. And watching these horses, like the males battle for the
oh
females,
yeah,
and
it's
they're
pretty
all
crazy.
torn up, and it's kind of amazing thing to go watch, really. And I understand it, but there's also, good reason, as hunters and conservationists, to like pay attention to what's going on and get involved and not be scared to get into the controversy and discuss this and get educated and see if the Forest Service or the BLM are doing what they're supposed to, and then start trying to, advocate for, management and appropriate
Right,
management
right.
necessary.
Yeah, I think
It's
most people have shied away from doing it, especially this herd by me, is because they're afraid of the backlash,
Yeah. Well,
and
you got to pick your battles, right?
that's why I'm pretty sure the
Yeah.
Forest Service hasn't done anything about it because they don't want to be, they don't want to deal with it.
No, they don't, and
But
nor do they
eventually
really
it's
have
yeah, but
resources.
eventually it's
Yeah.
gonna have to be dealt with because it's a bad situation. Like
Yeah.
I'm
And I
very
think that's the only
fearful of that habitats getting destroyed like badly.
totally. I think that's the only reason why this area that we're talking about in Arizona is being brought into light is, for the most part, is it's gotten way too far. And, it could be a good example of our poster child of like, we let this get too far. We've done all the research. We need to do something about it and look at other places that maybe aren't at this level yet, or maybe they are, and start using this as a
Yeah.
model.
Yeah.
And there might be other models out there that I'm not familiar with. Like, I'm really, like I said, just kind of getting myself acquainted with all of these issues with horses. And, I've gotten deeper into it now that I own Mustangs, and, my wife is very passionate about them, and she supports all of this too. Like, she really thinks that there should be serious management, and a lot of people that are Mustang owners and understand, wildlife and conservation also believe the same thing. I think, that's just like many topics where the extremes are the most vocal. The guys and gals that want all the horses off the landscape, get them the hell out of there. It's only for wildlife. And the people that are like, no, these are like sacred beings. They're like gods to me, basically. Like, don't touch them, are the ones that, spread the most information out there. And
Well,
you
yeah,
really need people.
that's just everything going along with hunting too. We have the same problem.
Yeah.
It's the other side's always the loudest and the squeakiest wheel because not that we're less passionate as sportsmen than they are, but that's how they, wield their battles. And we've always quietly, been the silent majority type situation or however you want to put it, but where we don't stand up. And, that's like what Hal's been trying to do is to change that. We have to be activists. It's that dirty word that people don't want to hear because it's usually associated with the opposition. But in all essence, you kind of have to take a page out of their book and not necessarily play dirty, but like they do, but to do some of the same things that they do and have the same approach. So that's the only way to get heard.
Yeah, certainly. And, Powell for me is really changed the game, I think, for people being able to make an impact and reach directly to their representatives and those involved in these types of action items that, make the decisions, just because, we're all so busy. Like, I just had my daughter, like, well, she's 2 weeks old now. And, my
Awesome.
first kid, and the amount of, time I have now is decreasing even more, and just having tools like Howl to be able to like become aware first off of something that's going on, and then have a location where you can quickly find, credible research and credible information on these topics all in one location where their action items are. It's gotten me able to like really jump on certain things that I didn't know really existed,
Right.
in a really good structure. And then immediately be able to be like, you know what, like I do want to say something about this. And even if it's just one extra vote towards yay or nay towards a specific issue, like this one, where the structure in place from Howl that sends it directly to your representatives and people that are trying to address this feral horse issue. It's awesome. It's really great, and it doesn't take hardly any time, right? I mean,
Right. And that was the goal, because we have this in society now, this philosophy that if it takes like more than 30 seconds, we can't even get through our video on social media. That's why like Vines and stuff like that TikToks became really popular, because you can just flip through content that's a few seconds long, get your fix and move on.
Totally.
Yeah. It's so funny.
I mean, Howell's adapted to it.
What's that?
I said Howell's adapted to that current way of doing things, and for better or worse, it's the way it is. And for a lot of folks, not like you said, not a lot of people take the time or have the time or think they have the time to do stuff like this. And being able to have that tool is really helpful for sure.
Well, thank you. Thanks. Thanks for helping us out with some of these. You've definitely been a good source of knowledge and helped us out a lot through the process here. And want to make sure you're recognized for that. So, well, thanks for coming on and talking with me about this situation. If you guys that are listening in want to get involved, get on the Howl Action Center and let your opinion be heard. So with that, I will bid you adieu, and we will talk to you soon. Appreciate you, Johnson.
You're welcome. Good to talk with you, John.
Thanks.